I'm the Big Shot Critic. Today, you better strap yourselves in because you are in for a ride. The Skyfall project began as a thought in late 2012. Skyfall hit theaters, and the first time I saw it, I noticed 3 references to the 3 earlier Bond films that I was most familiar with: Quantum of Solace, Casino Royale, and GoldenEye. I figured since Skyfall was the big 50th anniversary of the franchise, it must have at least one reference to each of the prior 22 Bond films, and I simply wasn't familiar enough with the franchise to notice the other 19. At that time, there were probably about a dozen of them that I had never seen before. 5 years later, I watched all of the Bond films in order for the first time, and I remembered that thought I had. I was looking for the references I missed. I quickly realized that looking for James Bond references in a James Bond movie is like looking for sand on the beach. I could not believe how often this franchise references itself. 2 years after that, I started this YouTube channel, and that little thought had evolved. It had grown. The challenge wasn't to find just one reference from Skyfall to each of the prior James Bond films. The challenge now was to find all of the Bond references to all of the prior Bond films. And the challenge was accepted. Are you strapped in yet? I must include a spoiler warning. All James Bond movies from 1962 to 2015 have moderate to severe spoilers in this video. Yes, I'm including Spectre here. I saw some videos that tried to do just those references and I found them lacking. So, spoilers ahead. You've been warned. Just one more thing before we get started. I left out standard James Bond conventions, such as the gun barrel sequence or Bond using gadgets on his watch. I also left out intentional story callbacks, such as Bond visiting his wife's grave in For Your Eyes Only, or noticing the tape marked Vesper Lind Interrogation in Spectre. Because every audience member is meant to notice those things, whether or not they're a long-term fan. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Skyfall project. I hope you're ready. Let's get started. Just a few minutes into Skyfall, Bond is riding shotgun in a car driven by a woman who is also a spy. When she breaks her side mirror, he jokes about her driving.
It's alright. You weren't using it.
Almost the exact same scenario takes place in The Spy Who Loved Me.
Let's try reverse, that's backwards.
But Roger Moore is much more merciless than Daniel Craig, and in Skyfall, Moneypenny has a pithy comeback that would make 006 proud.
I wasn't using that one either.
Also, the movie starts in Istanbul, and whenever the Bond movies go to Istanbul, it feels like a reference to From Russia with Love. The Spy Who Loved Me also references From Russia with Love with its train brawl sequence between Bond and the primary henchman Jaws, with the Bond girl present as well. The original train brawl in From Russia with Love was also between Bond and the primary henchman, with the Bond girl present. This has been referenced 2 other times in Live and Let Die and Spectre. You could say that the boat that swallows submarines in The Spy Who Loved Me is a reference to the spacecraft that swallows other spacecraft in You Only Live Twice. You could also say the climactic battle sequences that both feature large groups fighting in a giant set with a fortified section up high where the villain is hiding is also a reference. And you could say the final shots of Bond being picked up by the Navy while alone in a survival raft with the Bond girl is a reference. You could say these are references, but since Lewis Gilbert directed both and had a lot of story input on both, we'll just let you decide what's being referenced and what's being recycled. But this is a good time to point out that these shots of the model boat swallowing the model submarine were actually filmed from the same abandoned construction site in the Bahamas where the parkour chase was filmed in Casino Royale. And that abandoned construction site is actually next door to the hotel where parts of Thunderball were filmed. And the owner of all that land was married to this girl.
Oh, you're mad. Do you know that?
Yes, isn't everyone?
And she appears at a poker table 41 years later in Casino Royale. And the other extra at that table was the owner of the Ocean Club at that time, where this scene was set and filmed. And every time the franchise returns to the Bahamas, it feels like a reference to Thunderball. Near the end of The Spy Who Loved Me, the villain takes a shot at Bond with his secret under-the-table rocket gun, and Bond replies,
You shot your boat, Stromberg. Now it's my turn.
This is similar to a moment in Dr. No.
I'm working for...
Mr. Smith & Wesson. And you've had your 6.
And it's referenced again in The Living Daylights.
All right, you've had your 8. Now I'll have my 80.
Back to Skyfall, Bond and Moneypenny are still in the car when they pull this maneuver. This is very similar to a scene in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Nobody tell Moneypenny, but the last time this happened, Bond married the girl. And On Her Majesty's Secret Service is referenced again in Bond's cufflinks, believe it or not, which feature Bond's family crest and motto, Orbis non sufficit. His family motto was discussed in this scene, and the English translation was used as the title of the 19th Bond film. Later in that movie, we get what is possibly the very first time the franchise references itself, when Bond gets involved in some mild horseplay in a barn with the Bond girl.
It's not New Year yet.
Which reminds me of this scene in Goldfinger.
Get up.
And Goldfinger is referenced again at Bond's wedding at the end.
Yes, November 64, the bowling club.
Back to Skyfall. In pursuit of Patrice, Bond gets on a train leaving Istanbul. Much of From Russia with Love takes place on a train out of Istanbul, and the interior of that train was pretty much copy-pasted into Spectre. And in that movie, we get this scene where Bond tries to teach Madeline how to use a gun, only to realize she already knows. Which reminds me of this scene in GoldenEye.
Do you know how to use one of these?
Yes.
Good.
And speaking of GoldenEye, the title of that movie is a reference to Ian Fleming's Jamaican estate, which is called GoldenEye. Back out of that rabbit hole, the manner in which Bond boards the train is pulled straight from this scene in Octopussy, along with the subsequent fight on top of the train, tunnel and all. And in the same scene, Bond gets injured in the shoulder, another possible reference to Octopussy, which is also referenced in The World Is Not Enough, where Bond is injured in the opening and needs to be cleared by medical before returning to service, just like in Skyfall, and possibly also in License to Kill, where we see this shoulder scar on Bond. And now on to Octopussy. The first thing I'm going to mention is not a reference, but an actress. Christina Wayborn plays Magda, and I'm only mentioning her because I got her autograph on a Quantum of Solace poster. I saw it at midnight. This was in the days preview screenings were at midnight, and she was there for a special screening just before mine. She was a very pleasant person and very kind. This next one is a doozy. Bond goes to a casino and his contact points out the main villain who is cheating someone in what is supposed to be a game of chance. This exact same thing happens in the beginning of Goldfinger. Later in the scene, Bond takes the poor man's place in the game and stakes a particular Fabergé egg as collateral that is actually the property of the villain already. This is similar to another scene in Goldfinger where Bond stakes a gold bar in a game of golf against the villain, and the Octopussy scene is echoed in a scene from Die Another Day where Bond stakes the villain's diamonds in a fencing match with the villain himself. This fencing scene is itself a reference to another Roger Moore scene in Moonraker. Back to Octopussy, when Bond wins by using the villain's own trick dice, the henchman crushes them in his fist to threaten Bond. Exactly as done with the golf ball in Goldfinger. Did you get all that? This weapon here is obviously a reference to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which came out 34 years later. In this scene, Bond uses an alligator disguise to sneak around, similar to the duck disguise used in Goldfinger, and the manta ray disguise used in License to Kill. Both the alligator and duck disguise can be seen in the famous Q Branch storage scene in Die Another Day, which also references this airplane from the beginning of Octopussy, This trick climbing rope, also from Octopussy. This briefcase from Russia with Love. The jetpack from Thunderball. And the knife shoe, also from Russia with Love. And finally, the scene ends with Q giving Bond his new gadget watch, which he remarks is his 20th, in reference to that movie itself being the 20th Bond film.
Now, new watch. This will be your 20th, I believe.
Octopussy's circus is a bit like Pussy Galore's flying circus in Goldfinger, and this two-wheel stunt is a reference to the famous two-wheel stunt from Diamonds Are Forever, which is referenced again in what I think is one of Bond's best ever stunts in License to Kill. At the climax of Octopussy, Bond defuses a nuclear bomb just as he did in The Spy Who Loved Me. And at the very end, Octopussy's circus performers infiltrate the villain's palace while posing as gypsies for cover. I don't know why, but to me this feels like a reference to the big fight between the gypsies and the Bulgarians in From Russia with Love. There are no hard commonalities, besides the fact that it's a big fight and gypsies are sort of involved in both. This scene also has my number one most favorite Bond reference of all of them. This one had me laughing out loud in amazement, even while I was looking for Bond references. But to see that one, you're going to have to wait till the end of the video. Back to Skyfall, Moneypenny accidentally shoots Bond while aiming for Patrice, and Bond falls off the train bridge and backflops into a river. A lot like the way Zorin dies at the end of A View to a Kill. Later on in Skyfall, A View to a Kill is referenced again when Bond is climbing around an elevator shaft and climbs out the elevator door, just like he did in A View to a Kill. In the opening of A View to a Kill, Bond is skiing and one of his skis breaks while he's under enemy fire, so he goes slalom, just like he did in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Later in the movie, Bond is meeting with Zorin, who has a hidden camera behind his desk, just like Osato did in You Only Live Twice. Osato's had an X-ray device that let him know Bond was armed, while Zorin's had some kind of face recognition that told him who Bond was. And then Dolph Lundgren shows up. When Zorin reveals his evil plan to his, evil plan investors, he calls it Main Strike, and has a little relief map that pops up. He asks for each of them to invest $100 million, and one of his evil plan investors backs out, so Zorin lets him out of the room and has Mayday kill him. Flashback to Goldfinger, where Auric Goldfinger reveals his evil plan to his evil plan investors. He calls it Grand Slam. He has a relief map that pops up. His evil plan investors have already invested through individual deals, and Goldfinger owes each of them $1 million. He tells them they can have $1 million now or $10 million tomorrow. But one of his investors wants out. He lets him out of the room and has Oddjob kill him. But the Goldfinger references don't stop there. While at the Bond girl's house, we learn her cat is named Pussy, a fun little nod to the most ridiculously named Bond girl of them all, Goldfinger's Pussy Galore. Back to Skyfall, we are finally in the title sequence and we get a glimpse of a Red Skull. This is totally a reference to Captain America the First Avenger, which came out just a year before. I'm just messing with you. It's a very thin reference to Live and Let Die's title sequence, which features something similar. Skyfall's other reference to Live and Let Die is more substantial. When Bond is escaping a pit where some Komodo dragons live, he steps on one to get a small boost. Similar to this moment where Bond runs across several alligators to safety. Someone really did that, by the way, and it blows my mind. Also in Live and Let Die, Bond charters a boat run by Quarrel Jr., who one assumes is the son of Quarrel, the man running the boat chartered by Bond in Dr. No. And both characters are echoed somewhat in the character of Sharky from License to Kill. We get a scene of Bond and Quarrel Jr. hiding their boat when they come sneaking around, just like this scene in Dr. No. And at the end of Live and Let Die, the villain intends to kill Bond and Solitaire by lowering them into a water tank, complete with sharks that come through a gate, just like the setup at Palmyra, the villain's estate in Thunderball. The use of sharks by a villain would be repeated in License to Kill, and that breathing device Bond used in Thunderball can be seen again in this scene in Die Another Day. Remember that train brawl in Live and Let Die? Just before that, the Bond girl shows up in a blue nightie, which is very similar to what the Bond girl wore in From Russia with Love, before the original train brawl. Back to Skyfall, we're still in the title sequence. There's this short Hall of Mirrors segment that a lot of people think is Skyfall's reference to the man with the golden gun, but I disagree. I think that comes later, when Bond finally meets Silva. Silva is showing off a little bit and also trying to tempt Bond by describing all the secret missions he could choose for himself.
Name it. Name it. Destabilize a multinational by manipulating stocks, but easy. Interrupt transmissions from a spy satellite over Kabul. Done. Rig an election in Uganda, all to the highest bidder.
Or a gas explosion in London.
Just point and click.
Well, everybody needs a hobby.
This tease from Bond in particular, everybody needs a hobby, reminds me a lot of his tease for Scaramanga in The Man with the Golden Gun.
Well, we all get our jollies one way or another.
And the setting of that scene, in the crowd at a fight in Asia, is a reference to this similar scene in You Only Live Twice. Or maybe the Skyfall reference to The Man with the Golden Gun is when Bond visits a casino in Macau. He does that in both movies. Or maybe it's the villain's private island. The other Bond villains never had their own island, but I still like to think it's Bond's little tease. Also, the South China Sea locale of Scaramanga's island is seen again at the end of Tomorrow Never Dies. The belly dancer featured in The Man with the Golden Gun is a reference to the belly dancer scene in From Russia with Love. When Bond tails Scaramanga's girlfriend on a hydrofoil ferry, it feels like a reference to the villain's boat in Thunderball, which becomes a hydrofoil at the end. A fully functioning MI6 office within the wreck of the Queen Elizabeth in Victoria Harbor is very reminiscent of this scene in You Only Live Twice, that features the traditional style MI6 office in a submarine in Victoria Harbor. And at the very end of The Man with the Golden Gun, a henchman climbs in the roof above Bond to try to kill him while he's in bed, just like this scene from You Only Live Twice. Back to Skyfall, we are finally through the title sequence and M is writing Bond's obituary, just like Elliot Carver was in this scene in Tomorrow Never Dies. Of course, this is also a reference to this scene in You Only Live Twice, which is also in Victoria Harbor. In Tomorrow Never Dies, Carver has a stealth boat that opens in the middle for access to the water, just like the bad guy's boat in Thunderball, which was also referenced in License to Kill. Then Carver uses that nasty can-opener-looking torpedo to attack the HMS Devonshire, and we have a British military vessel in distress, just as in this scene in The Spy Who Loved Me, and this scene in For Your Eyes Only. And then Gerard Butler shows up. After the Devonshire sinks, Carver has his men dive down and steal a missile from it, just as the bad guys in Thunderball stole missiles from an airplane they arranged to have crashed in the ocean. The main henchman in Tomorrow Never Dies is an enormous and obnoxiously blonde man, just like the main henchman in From Russia with Love. Okay, so this one is significant. The 1964 Aston Martin DB5 makes an appearance in this movie. It first appeared when it was brand new in Goldfinger, and as of 2015 it has appeared in no less than 6 additional Bond films, including Thunderball, GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies, Casino Royale, Skyfall, and Spectre. That car has become virtually synonymous with the character of James Bond. Now, in the scene when the car is first introduced in Goldfinger, Bond accuses Q of joking about some of his equipment briefing, which prompts Q's famous reply,
"I never joke about my work, 007.
This is referenced as Q is briefing Bond on his new Aston Martin in Die Another Day.
As I learned from my predecessor, Bond, I never joke about my work.
Back to Tomorrow Never Dies, is that Julian Fellows, writer and creator of Downton Abbey? And later in the movie, is that Hugh Bonneville? I bet you didn't know Downton Abbey was just a James Bond reunion. Bond's car defends itself against attackers, albeit a little less aggressively than in For Your Eyes Only. James Bond is a commander in the Royal Navy and has only showed up in a helicopter and in full uniform twice. Once in Tomorrow Never Dies, and once in The Spy Who Loved Me. Another recurring scene is the underwater investigation. In Tomorrow Never Dies, Bond investigates alone and encounters the Bond girl doing the same thing, as she is a Chinese spy, also doing spy stuff. This is a reference to this scene in Thunderball, where Bond investigates the wreckage of that airplane I told you about by himself. And in For Your Eyes Only, Bond investigates a shipwreck with the Bond girl to find the all-important ATAC machine. In that scene, in For Your Eyes Only, an enemy diver attacks them, and Bond places the self-destruct charge from the ATAC device on the man's diving suit. This is echoed in this scene in Casino Royale. And those officers that have Bond in custody in Casino Royale are Miami police, which to my mind is close enough to be a reference to Goldfinger.
It's only by the grace of God, your friend Leiter, and my intervention with the British Embassy in Washington, that you're not in the custody of the Miami Beach Police.
Okay, back to Tomorrow Never Dies. Bond and Bond girl are captured and brought to Carver, who proceeds to compare himself to Napoleon.
Caesar had his legions, Napoleon had his armies. I have my divisions. TV, news, magazines.
This might remind you of this scene in Dr. No.
World domination. Same old dream. Our asylums are full of people who think they're Napoleon or God.
And maybe this scene in Spectre.
He's a visionary like me.
Visionaries. Psychiatric wards are full of them.
The last reference from Tomorrow Never Dies is one that barely made the cut. But this hallway in Carver's stealth boat reminds me just enough of this corridor in Stromberg's lair and The Spy Who Loved Me. And back to Skyfall. Part of the MI6 headquarters blows up, just like it did in The World Is Not Enough. And later in Skyfall, when Q gives Bond his equipment, we get this line.
A gun and a radio. Not exactly Christmas, is it?
Which I believe is a reference to this character from The World Is Not Enough.
Miss?
Dr. Jones. Christmas Jones.
You might say that's a stretch, but that particular scene in Skyfall jokes about another ridiculous moment in Bond history. We'll get to that later. This scene in Skyfall, where Silva removes his prosthesis, is very often said to be a reference to Jaws, the famous henchman from The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. But I say that's wrong. This is a prosthetic hiding a villain's disfigurement, and we've seen that before, here in The World Is Not Enough. It's a reference to Elektra King. This scene in a corner office at the beginning of The World Is Not Enough reminds me a lot of this scene from the middle of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. It's hard to justify this one. They both take place in a corner office and Bond handles a large case in both, but that's all. I can't explain it, it just feels like a reference. In this scene, Bond meets Sir Robert King, Elektra's father, who is a construction magnate. And Sir King even half-jokingly mentions poaching Bond from MI6 to work for him. In this scene from On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Bond meets Tracy's dad, who is also a construction magnate, and he wants Bond to work for him. Here in this boat chase, Bond does a barrel roll, a reference to what I think is the greatest Bond stunt of all time, the corkscrew jump from The Man with the Golden Gun. Which is also referenced in Spectre. Has Jason Bourne done a barrel roll on land, sea, and air? I don't think so. Later on, Bond is being chased by snowmobiles when he pulls this maneuver.
See you back at the lodge.
Just like he did in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But the snowmobile deploys a parachute, just like Bond himself did in The Spy Who Loved Me. And the Union Jack thing was done again in Die Another Day. At the end of that scene, Bond and Elektra get caught in an avalanche, just like Bond and Tracy did later on in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. The architecture of Elektra's home in Baku reminds me of the church where Bond attends a funeral at the opening of Thunderball. He also attends a funeral in The World Is Not Enough, but that's not a reference. The one he attends in Spectre, however, is a reference. because Bond killed both of them. In Spectre, he killed the deceased beforehand, arguably the traditional method, but in Thunderball, the death was faked, and Bond made it official afterwards. The bad guy who faked his own death resorted to cross-dressing to hide his identity.
My dear Colonel Bouvard, I don't think you should have opened that car door by yourself.
A novel approach among Bond villains that would be repeated only by Blofeld in Diamonds Are Forever.
Well, 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 look what the cat dragged in.
A Bond girl loses a lot of money at a casino, just like in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. By itself, I wouldn't call this a reference, but On Her Majesty's Secret Service is referenced so many times in The World Is Not Enough, I decided to keep it in. I can't prove it, but I'm pretty much positive that is a very young Toby Kebbell. If you're watching, Toby, please confirm or deny. In this scene, Bond and Christmas climb on a sled that travels inside a pipeline, a clear reference to the sled thing inside the pipe in Diamonds Are Forever, and the people-smuggling pipeline sled in The Living Daylights. I also think the Diamonds Are Forever scene is referencing this pipe scene in Dr. No. And in the Diamonds Are Forever scene, Bond talks to a rodent.
One of us smells like a tart's handkerchief.
Something he would do again in Spectre. And in that scene, Bond sleeps in a chair next to the bed where the Bond girl is sleeping, just like he did in A View to a Kill. Phew! Back to The World Is Not Enough. This helicopter aerial saw is like the yo-yo saw in Octopussy. Bond's missile-lock helicopter attack from his car here is exactly like his missile-lock helicopter attack in The Spy Who Loved Me. And finally, when Bond and Christmas launch themselves out of the torpedo tube of the submarine at the end, it is a reference to Bond doing the same thing out of that submarine we mentioned earlier in Victoria Harbor. Okay, back to Skyfall. A lot of people think the drinking game involving the Scorpion is a reference to Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd using a scorpion to kill someone at the beginning of Diamonds Are Forever. I disagree, but I do say that moment is referenced in the title sequence in Die Another Day. Later in Skyfall, Bond is hanging onto the outside of an elevator, similar to when he rode on the outside of an elevator in Diamonds Are Forever, and when he reaches the top, he hangs onto a bar for a moment, just like in Skyfall. In Diamonds Are Forever, Blofeld has some doubles made of himself through plastic surgery and movie magic. This could be a reference to Thunderball, which also had a villainous plot involving doubles. Also, Diamonds Are Forever had these exquisite sideburns to welcome James Bond to the 70s. This music in Skyfall sounds like this music in Goldfinger. To my eyes, the size and shape of this tracking device in Skyfall is reminiscent of the smaller of the two tracking devices given to Bond in Goldfinger. This exterior shot in Skyfall is outside John Barry's house. The famed composer, noted for scoring 11 James Bond films, had died just a few months before Skyfall began production, and I thought this was a nice way to commemorate him, although I do wonder how Thomas Newman felt about it. Remember when Bond got shot in the shoulder? Well, he's run out of leads in his investigation, so he decides now is a good time to dig that bullet out of his shoulder and have it analyzed. Why didn't medical have them removed in the onboarding process? Obviously, that would ruin the symbolism of Bond returning from the dead and personally overcoming his old wounds. Now remember, this is a Sam Mendes movie, so symbolism is very high on the priority list. But anyway, because he dug them out himself, we get this line when he brings them to Tanner.
Get these analyzed. For her eyes only.
This is a reference to the title of the 12th Bond movie. A more nuanced reference comes later when the villain is killed by a knife thrown in his back, just as the villain was in For Your Eyes Only. A major plot point in For Your Eyes Only is the Bond girl seeking revenge for her murdered parents. This is similar to Tilly Masterson seeking revenge for her murdered sister in Goldfinger. The way Goldfinger killed Jill brings us to what is probably the most obvious James Bond reference of all time, the death of Strawberry Fields in Quantum of Solace. And in Goldfinger, Tilly claims her rifle case is for ice skates.
Here for the hunting season. I had a case just like that one.
It's for my ice skates.
Lovely sport.
A sport in which For Your Eyes Only's BB is an Olympic contender. When Q leads Bond into a room that requires a key code, we get this.
I don't suppose you find it funny in the field.
Indeed, I don't.
This is a twofer. First, the villain in the previous movie was obsessed with the conquest of space, and he used recognizable space themes, such as this one, to organize his hunting party. And this one on the keypad to one of his secret laboratories. And it is also a reference to The Spy Who Loved Me because of the tune.
Indeed, I didn't.
Nobody does it better.
Remember Tracy's car from On Her Majesty's Secret Service? Well, Bond has another red car with skis on it in For Your Eyes Only. This chase on a bobsled track is also a reference to On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And is that Charles Dance? The driveway to this bungalow reminds me of the driveway to Miss Tarot's apartment in Dr. No. And Bond with a countess on the beach getting involved in a fight that includes vehicles is pulled straight from the opening of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Even the costumes match. Back to Skyfall. Bond is finally meeting Q, who tells him he reckons he could do more damage on his laptop in his pajamas before his first cup of Earl Grey than Bond could do in a year out in the field. Then this exchange.
Oh, so why do you need me?
Every now and then a trigger has to be pulled.
Or not pulled. It's hard to know which in your pajamas.
And this particular bit about pulling or not pulling the trigger, I believe, is a reference to this scene in The Living Daylights, where Bond is on Overwatch and decides to not kill the woman with the rifle after realizing she is anything but a KGB sniper. This idea is referenced again in Spectre.
A license to kill is also a license not to kill.
And that scene from The Living Daylights is itself a reference to this scene from Russia with Love.
Quick, he's coming.
And there's another scene in Moonraker that first references Goldfinger as Bond winks before escaping. And then references that same scene in From Russia with Love. The laser wheel gadget is a reference to the wheel grinder gadget. The villain pretending to be a statue is a reference to the same thing in The Man with the Golden Gun. This antenna smack is a reference to Octopussy. And this funny couch in Q's lab might be a reference to the couch that inflates around Whisper in Live and Let Die. Back to Skyfall. In the same scene, Q gives Bond some equipment, including a gun that recognizes his handprint, so only he can fire it, which is exactly like the rifle Q gave to Bond in this scene in License to Kill. And then a very young Benicio del Toro shows up. The use of a Coast Guard helicopter definitely feels like a reference to Thunderball. Bond often quips after dispatching an enemy, but there's only one he uses twice. Here in License to Kill.
Do you mind if I get my hands out of here?
Yeah, do it slowly.
Bon appetit.
And here in You Only Live Twice.
Bon appetit.
Bond forming an alliance with the villain's girl, who resides on the villain's boat, is very Thunderball. Anytime Bond is pursued with harpoon guns underwater, it feels like a reference to Thunderball. And that insane battle scene in Thunderball with a bunch of bad guys being met by a bunch of good guys who are delivered by some vehicle and then fight a whole lot is totally referenced in Moonraker, where there's a bunch of bad guys being met by a bunch of good guys who are delivered by some vehicle, and then they fight a whole lot. When the airplane wings are clipped, it's a reference to Live and Let Die.
Holy.
And it happens again in Spectre. And in Spectre, Bond goes on to lose the whole back half of his fuselage, just like this car that falls apart more and more in A View to a Kill. Back to that same scene in Skyfall, after Bond makes a smart remark about not getting that many gadgets, Q comes back with this.
Were you expecting an exploding pen? We don't really go in for that anymore.
Which is the first of the very original 3 references I noticed upon first viewing that led to this whole mess. It is an obvious reference to the exploding pen gadget from GoldenEye. And speaking of Bond's smart remarks, he's got a pretty good one after Q demonstrates the pen.
1, 2, 3. Don't say it.
The writing's on the wall?
The writings on the wall is a very old expression, but it was also used as the title of the Bond song in Spectre. And I'm counting that as a reference to GoldenEye. Ourumov yelling orders from the back seat is a bit like General Orlov doing the same thing in Octopussy. And then Bond gets his new car, the BMW Z3, which I obviously have to mention. Is it a reference? No. But I drive a Z3. It's a great looking car. That said, even I will admit that Bond belongs in an Aston Martin. Moving on. Xenia Onatop's MO of causing suffocation by squeezing someone between her legs may be a reference to this assassin mentioned in The Living Daylights.
Assassination methods? Strangulation with hands or thighs.
And in both GoldenEye and Octopussy, the villains are derided for making themselves nothing more than a common thief.
In the end, you're just a bank robber. Nothing more than a common thief.
A common thief? A disgrace to the uniform?
Back to Skyfall, when Bond waits for Patrice at the airport, it's a bit like when Felix waits for Bond at the airport in Dr. No. And right after Bond arrives at the airport in Dr. No, a local girl attempts to photograph him, just like in Moonraker. Now get this. Bond follows Patrice while he's on the job about to do a hit on some guy, and the setup for the target involves a painting. This painting is Woman with a Fan by Amedeo Modigliani, and the real one was stolen 2 years before Skyfall came out. This is a reference to this scene in Dr. No, where this painting is seen in Dr. No's lair. This is Portrait of the Duke of Wellington by Francisco Goya, and the real one was stolen a year before Dr. No came out. Moving right along, people often say Dr. No's costume in this scene is referenced by Blofeld's costume in Spectre. This is just lazy. It doesn't take much to see that Blofeld's costume is almost identical to Bond's costume in that same scene with Dr. No, right down to the loafers. And the chair Bond is fastened to in this scene is a little like the crazy torture chair Bond gets strapped into in The World Is Not Enough. And lastly, the cat in this scene is meant to immediately evoke Blofeld's cat from prior Bond appearances. And when it jumps on him, Bond reacts. Another reference to Pussy Galore from Goldfinger. The return of M's classic-style office at the end of Skyfall could be considered a reference to just about every Bond movie from Dr. No to A View to a Kill, the latter of which was the last time we saw M's old-style office, 27 years before Skyfall. I remember cheers in the audience when Tanner came through the padded door. Going back a little bit, Bond and Eve are in that casino in Macau when Bond gives her the following advice.
Don't touch your ear.
An obvious reference to Casino Royale.
He's on the move. He's on the move and he's heading straight for me.
Stop touching your ear.
And this was the second reference of the original 3 that I spotted. When Bond blows through a fence with a bulldozer, it's a reference to this scene. This one is another gut feeling, but the cranes in Casino Royale are a very particular shade of blue that is seen all over Blofeld's lair at the end of Diamonds Are Forever. This shot is like this shot. Bond causing a diversion by pretending to be a valet and crashing a car is a little like the Bond girl causing a diversion by pretending to be a harbor pilot and crashing the villain's boat in License to Kill. And yes, Bond emerging from the sea here is a reference to the famous Honey Rider scene from Dr. No. And Halle Berry's version in Die Another Day is a bit much, but the knife at the waist is a nice touch. Is that Richard Branson? And look at that, it's Martin Campbell, director of Casino Royale, in the same scene. Here, Bond follows a woman through Venice, just like here in Moonraker. And every time the Bond franchise goes to Venice, it feels like a reference to From Russia with Love. Back to Skyfall. Severine's wrist tattoo is a reference to this man's wrist tattoo in Thunderball. Now the big one I've been dodging around. After Bond says everybody needs a hobby, we get this.
So what's yours?
Resurrection.
And the whole resurrection thing is a reference to You Only Live Twice, a film where Bond dies at the beginning as well. Later on, Silva offers Bond 50-year-old Macallan, which is a nod to the franchise's 50th anniversary. The third and final of the original 3 references I found is seen here, when M and Silva come face to face for the first time.
Regret is unprofessional.
I think this is a reference to a similar remark made by M in Quantum of Solace.
I assume you have no regrets.
I don't. What about you?
Of course not. That would be unprofessional.
I understand this line is found in the books, but I'm calling it a reference anyway. When Bond holds M in his arms and she dies, it's a lot like when Bond held Mathis in his arms and he died. I always thought Craig's Bond had it rough, losing Vesper, Mathis, and M back to back to back. Here we have a fun musical reference to Thunderball. Here we get a disgruntled Italian as a result of Bond's chase scene,
Oh, mamma mia, che ho fatto?
just like in The Spy Who Loved Me.
Mamma mia, che è successo? Oddio, tutto distrutto!
I wouldn't take it as much by itself, but The Spy Who Loved Me is all over Quantum of Solace. Just a bit later, we get this scene, which is a lot like one from The Spy Who Loved Me. Take a look. Here we have Bond above and behind an outdoor public performance, taking down a bad guy. I think it's a reference to Moonraker. And then Bond plays cat and mouse with the bad guys around this enormous outdoor performance space, while you hear it in the background the whole time. Just like this scene in The Spy Who Loved Me.
No traveler, emperor, merchant, or poet has trodden on these sands and not gasped in awe.
And the action is intercut with the live performance, like another scene from The Spy Who Loved Me. And it all ends with Bond on the roof with a henchman, just like, you guessed it, another scene in The Spy Who Loved Me. Bond convinces Mathis to go with him to South America, and just before he agrees, off-screen, his woman tries to get his attention and is apparently denied.
Amore, dai, vieni, voglio sentire le tue mani sulla schiena.
As mentioned earlier, Mathis dies in this movie. I think this is a foreshadowing moment because in From Russia with Love, Bond's primary contact is trying to get some work done, and his woman tries to get his attention.
You are not glad to see me this morning, Cherie.
Overjoyed.
I no longer please you.
Be still.
He finally relents, and it ends up saving his life, because a bomb goes off at the other end of the room where he would have been. Is this a stretch? Yeah, maybe. But we've seen a ton of style and context references already in Quantum of Solace. Here we have the Bond girl from Quantum of Solace looking for all the world like Electra King from The World Is Not Enough. Then Bond and the Bond girl walk through the desert in formal attire, just like they did in... what was it? Oh yeah, The Spy Who Loved Me. They eventually walk into Bond's fancy hotel, very dirty from their trip. That is a reference to Die Another Day, when Bond walked into another fancy hotel, not at all dressed for it. In that scene, the hotel staff recognize Bond and offer him his usual suite, just like they did in The Living Daylights.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bond. You will need your usual suite.
Also in that scene, Bond asks them to send up his tailor.
Perhaps you could send out my tailor and some food.
This hotel is in Hong Kong. It's a reference to this line in Diamonds Are Forever.
We could be on a plane and out of the country by tomorrow night. Rio, Hong Kong.
I knew a good tailor in Hong Kong.
And when Bond gets to his room and a masseuse is sent to spy on him, Chinese agents are hiding behind a mirror, filming Bond. A clear reference to From Russia with Love, when Spectre agents pulled the same trick. These military costumes sure remind me of these other military costumes. And at the end of Quantum of Solace, the villain attacks Bond with a fire axe, just as the villain did in A View to a Kill. Back to Skyfall. Q and Bond are doing computer things, and Bond mentions an abandoned tube station.
Remember Road. It's an old tube station on the Metropolitan line. Been closed for years. Use that as a key.
This is a reference to Die Another Day, when Bond was summoned to an abandoned tube station by M. Later in Bond's assignment in Die Another Day, he picks up a particular book in the office of his Cuban contact. This is a riff on the whole franchise. Ian Fleming pulled the name James Bond from the cover of that very book, A Field Guide to Birds of the West Indies by James Bond. So that's a fun reference. And Gustav Graves' space laser made out of diamonds is pulled straight from Diamonds Are Forever, and not too much dissimilar from the GoldenEye satellite in GoldenEye. Bond uses parts from a broken vehicle to make a board to ride on, as he did in A View to a Kill. This is a reference to the famous scene from Goldfinger. And finally, Bond and the Bond girl escaping a plane using a vehicle in the back is a reference to The Living Daylights. Back to Skyfall, when Bond turns on a light to help in his pursuit of Silva, it's a bit like when he does the same thing in Moonraker. He uses a double-barreled shotgun in Skyfall, a weapon he has only handled once before in this scene in Moonraker. And that Moonraker scene was a reference to this scene in Thunderball. The parade and street festival in Moonraker is Carnival, and is referencing the Junkanoo scene in Thunderball. That is also referenced in Spectre's Day of the Dead scene. In Thunderball, Bond is pursued through the parade, and in Spectre, Bond pursues someone else through the parade. The tram scene in Moonraker definitely feels like a reference to the ski lift scene from On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Both feature someone in the mechanical room, and this thread continues in Spectre with Q's small action scene. There's also a ski village aspect to this scene that is a repeated motif throughout the franchise, seen here in For Your Eyes Only, and where it began in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. The second boat chase in Moonraker feels a lot like a reference to the boat chase in From Russia with Love. The two scenes play out very similarly, but I'm not going to include the whole scenes here. The mines that Bond drops are the only direct visual comparison, like the barrels he drops in From Russia with Love. When Bond finally arrives at the villain's lair in Moonraker, he is subtly encouraged to walk across this bridge. But Bond has been there, done that, with the trick bridge from You Only Live Twice. So we get this hilarious subversion when he walks around instead. Bond and the girl are eventually trapped in this room with a circular ceiling, which is a visual reference to this room from Dr. No. And the disembodied voice of Dr. No in that scene
Sit down.
is referenced in this scene in Spectre.
Touch it. You can touch it if you want.
And finally, Bond pretends to be an astronaut, just like he did in You Only Live Twice. Okay, home stretch. We're done with Skyfall. We're going to blow through Spectre, and we're going to finish on that favorite that I promised to show you at the end. The elevator Bond uses is like the one from License to Kill. Just a few moments later, he steps out the window exactly like he did in Diamonds Are Forever. Then he's on the roof aiming at 2 windows across the way, just like License to Kill again. Just a bit after that, he falls and is surprised to land sitting down, just like later on in that same scene in Diamonds Are Forever. The Spectre ring makes a comeback from earlier films like Thunderball. The falling figures in the title sequence look a lot like this scene from Quantum of Solace. When Moneypenny asks Bond if he just moved in,
You just moved in.
it's a follow-through of a line from Skyfall when M tells Bond,
Oh, we've sold your flat.
and that scene also features the gift left to Bond after M died. And the scene itself is about Bond asking Moneypenny's discreet help, something he has only done once before in The Living Daylights. The Smart Blood scene is just like the tracker scene in Casino Royale. The Spectre meeting is very much modeled after the Spectre meeting in Thunderball, and the character of Hinks is... I was about to say a walking, talking reference to Jaws, but neither of them really talk. They're both enormous. Hinks has just one word of dialogue, and Jaws has just one sentence at the end of his second movie. Hinks has metal thumbnails, which makes about as much sense as Jaws' metal teeth. Then we get a henchman in a Jag chasing Bond in his Aston with the use of some spy gadgets, just like in Die Another Day. Then Bond arrives at a mountaintop clinic from the air. I wonder what that could be referencing. Then stuff goes down and Bond flies alongside the bad guys on the road and starts shooting, which is exactly what happened to Bond in The Spy Who Loved Me. The aircraft are even painted almost the same. Then Bond wears the same tuxedo he did in Goldfinger. This sunrise transition shot is just like this one in The Spy Who Loved Me. I know this is a 1948 Rolls-Royce Silver Wraith because Bond says so.
That is a 1948 Rolls-Royce Silver Wraith.
Bond was picked up by a 1958 Rolls-Royce Silver Wraith once before in From Russia with Love. But in Spectre, it takes him to Blofeld's lair, where he and the Bond girl are received as if they are VIPs at a nice hotel. They are greeted and shown to their rooms, where they each have a change of clothes waiting for them. This is all a reference to Dr. No, where Bond and Honey Ryder got the same treatment. Greeted, shown to their rooms, change of clothes. Blofeld's surveillance room is a reference to Drax's launch control room from Moonraker. The name of the MI6 safe house, Hildebrand, Prince and Rarities, is a riff on the Ian Fleming James Bond short story, The Hildebrand Rarity. In Spectre, we actually see the MI6 memorial wall that has been mentioned in both Skyfall and GoldenEye.
Your name is on the memorial wall of the very building you attacked.
No longer just an anonymous star on the memorial wall at MI6.
The name Tiago Rodriguez cannot be found on the wall, so one assumes M kept her promise from Skyfall that Silva's real name would be struck off. The name Alec Trevelyan is also not present. This is a reference to this. Bond shooting at the villain only to realize he is protected by bulletproof glass is from The World Is Not Enough, complete with the villain activating a timer for explosives as he exits. Bond leaving the MI6 building in a boat is also from The World Is Not Enough. And finally, Spectre ends with Bond's feat of marksmanship, shooting down Blofeld's helicopter with his pistol from his pursuing boat while the Bond girl drives. Moonraker ended in a similar way with another feat of marksmanship, shooting Drax's last death satellite with his space laser on manual targeting mode from his pursuing space shuttle while the Bond girl drove. When I say those words out loud, I'm forced to remember how ridiculous Moonraker is. And it's Moonraker that started my very favorite Bond reference of all of the ones I found. Remember when Bond's boat became a land vehicle? That scene gives us this reaction shot. The same man was on the beach in The Spy Who Loved Me when Bond drove the Lotus out of the ocean. And again, he was in Cortina when Bond skied over the patio table pursued by 2 motorcycles. By the time I caught that one, I was laughing my head off in disbelief. But when they pulled the same gag here in Octopussy, when the circus performers are infiltrating Khan's palace, I lost it. It's a different actor in Octopussy, but the gag played just as well. I couldn't believe it. So that's it. You made it. That's all the references I found in the Skyfall project. I'm sure I didn't catch all of them, but I'll tell you what. If you find more, or if you know of more, you make the video. Because I need a break. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. My previous videos, I captured 20 or 30 clips to use. This one I didn't count, but I know it was somewhere in the area of 300. This was so much bigger than my previous videos, and I put a lot into it, and I really hope you guys enjoyed it. Be sure to like and subscribe. Bye-bye.